Hello and welcome to the Film Ireland podcast. I'm Gemma Creagh and I'm chatting with Phyllida Lloyd ahead of the release of her fabulous new film herself. So just wondering if you could give me a little bit of a description of the film from your point of view.
Yeah, it's a story of a woman who runs from an abusive relationship, taking her two children with her, and ends up in emergency accommodation in a hotel with absolutely no prospect of any social housing becoming available to her. So she decides to take matters into her own hands and plans to build her own house with her own hands in the middle of a city. And it's really about what happens when you kind of ask for help and you have your plan and it sort of fails, but other help comes from other angles. It's about what happens if you kind of put it out there. And it's looking at an abused so-called character as not a victim, but somebody who is in many ways a kind of a hero of her own life, who is just determined to create a home for her kids.
And definitely, yeah, not a victim, a survivor. And I think there's one thing it's just so impressive is the agency. And again, I dealing with topics that heavy, there's such optimism and what's the word, humor throughout it, which like I think that you can have like a description of the film, but it doesn't do the nuance, warmth and joy in the film even justice, because even I was reading the description earlier and I was like, God, like it's an enjoyable watch from beginning to end, which a lot of, say, films that deal with homelessness or issues or anything like that can be tough.
I mean, I think that was one of the things that really struck me when I first read the screenplay, was how Claire's wit and you know, without wanting to stray into cliche about Ireland, that how even when the chips are down, you know, the one-liners, the crack is coming in from the side just to relieve the sheer hell of the situation. And I think I found that very kind of compelling in her writing, that Sandra, there's a lot of wit and humour in it. But I sort of felt people have said to me, gosh, the tone, you know, how would you describe it, this kind of, and I kind of go, you know, I don't know whether it's Claire and me both feeling that, you know, you can be in the midst of death and disaster, but comedy and tragedy lie very, very close side by side. That seemed very kind of natural to us in a way.
And you do that, you have these kind of smaller moments. Again, there's a lot of nuance throughout the film, in the relationships within the film, and then capturing what is a beautiful kind of mother-daughter relationship, and even exploring what PTSD is. It's all, and you know, it's not, this is a huge big moments, it's lots of little small moments that kind of that grip you, and by the end of it I think you, just as a viewer, you feel like you've been on this stunning journey. So actually you go back about reading the script, so again you've done some humongous films. What kind of made you step and pick this as your next one?
So when I was working with Claire and Harriet in the theatre on a series of all-female Shakespeare plays set in women's prisons, where we'd been very preoccupied by the impact of domestic abuse on women's lives and their journeys into the criminal justice system. And Claire had a friend who had run from an abusive marriage, partnership, and had to declare herself homeless in Dublin. And she was possessed with a kind of fury at the injustice, the lack of social housing and the lack of provision and the lack of a kind of harbour for women in this way. And she started thinking, I wonder what would happen if this woman actually got to just build her own house for herself. And so she started Googling. She found Dominic Stevens, the architect on whom we built, whose house we built. And she, because we were working together, she gave me the screenplay one day to read. And it wasn't like, will you direct this? It's more, what do you think of this? And I was immediately struck by her instinctive sense of, for someone who'd never written a screenplay before, her sense of the proportion of a screenplay, you know, how the relationship between words and silence and images and words and the way in which she told this very grueling, harrowing story with such kind of freshness and spirit and, yes, humour, our wit. And so I was thinking, well, you know, this has to be directed by somebody who knows the city, who knows the territory, and I'll just kind of be supportive and give feedback. But gradually, of course, I got more and more sucked into it, and other projects that I was thinking about just began to literally fall out of my mind, more and more focused on it. And I also was really focused on the fact that Claire was struggling to get work on screen. We'd taken our productions to New York, and she was auditioning in the film world. And as you know, she has a birthmark on one of her eyes. And in a world of, you know, immaculate perfection for women, she was really struggling with that. And I was thinking, you know, to hell with this. This woman is an absolutely extraordinary talent, an acting talent, writing, whatever. But she has to be seen on screen. She has to get work, and this is ridiculous. And so, you know, all of these things were happening kind of in parallel. But gradually, I began to think, you know, if I did this, then I could make this a kind of, I'll do this, but Claire has to play the lead. And if that they decide to get another director because I'm making that the condition, then so be it. But let's just go for it. And we then just got great support from Element and Ed Guiney and Sharon Horgan, who knew that, you know, raising the money would be harder with an unknown actress at the centre. And then it was probably even harder when I said, I don't really want to have to cast so-called stars in the other roles just to justify having Claire, because I thought, oh, it's going to become about, you know, the other characters, and this has got to be about her. So I started getting kind of wrangling this and saying, you know, I really want to just have a great cast of an Irish ensemble, the best actors. And so then the discussion was, well, maybe I should take the budget down so that we didn't have to worry about casting stars. And everybody was like, are you sure about this? Because, you know, money equals time on a film, and will you have enough time to make it? So I don't know. I was bungee jumping, but knowing instinctively that I wanted it to be about Claire and about Sandra. And so that's how we ended up shooting it in 5 weeks. And but I guess because Claire, Harriet and I particularly had a really big history. There was a lot of trust, there was a lot of preparation, there was a lot of, if something didn't work, we were able to just regroup. Claire was the writer, she could write some more lines or whatever. And we were able to somehow, and I was, you know, lucky to work with a great Irish DP, Tom Comerford, who saved me from myself in many places. But I wanted to sort of somehow, just because it was Fast and Furious, I wanted to make sure that it still had beauty and poetry. And he helped me, I guess, try to find that, even though we were, you know, running like mad women from A to B.
And again, you get that sense of camaraderie, and the film, I suppose, is about that in a lot of ways. How what stage did you come on board for the script? So you were kind of approached for notes, and then maybe then had a chat with Element that you wanted to do it, or would it have been like an informal chat? Like, I'm just curious about the process of how films get made, really.
I think that Claire, whether all of this is in the right order, I don't know, and she would remember exactly the order probably. But she started writing it. She was asking for feedback. She had some small grant, maybe from Screen Ireland or some kind of development grant. So that was that was happening. And then at some point she wrote to Sharon Horgan, and Sharon loved the screenplay but hadn't produced a film before. And so we then went, well, there's this company Element, and so we then made contact with Ed Guiney, and he and Sharon were like, well, we both like this script and we'd love to work together. So they then became, they said they'd take it on. And I was sort of, by the time we met Sharon, I think I had said to Claire, I'd love to direct it. But these things, are really long processes. And what is good is that, it's 3 public bodies that have paid for this: the Screen Ireland, the BBC Films, and the British Film Institute. And this is all public money. Each of those bodies, incidentally, headed up by, or in our case, the lead person was great women, all of whom were passionate about the script. But, they really do due diligence to their, I would say, customers, the taxpayer. And so they put you through a really rigorous script development process. But I would say that it's pretty, and sometimes that can become, for a director and writer who's thinking of sodding hell, let's get this out of development, we just want to make this thing. But I would say that the taste amongst us, there was a lot of synchronicity, and they were very helpful, and they gave great notes. And then Malcolm Campbell came on board in the kind of latter stages of it. I think the BBC felt that, a large number of their films, they bring on a second writer in the final stage to kind of kick the thing over the line and in some way relieve Claire from having, Claire had to start thinking about playing the lead, and she'd written herself this almighty role in which every single scene there was something enormous to pull off. And, or not every single, but you know what I mean, there were a number of like, oh, and another thing, and so that was another part of the process where she moved from being really the writer to being the lead. And of course she remained the writer because she was there on the set, but it was an interesting part of the process. And Malcolm was able to look at what we were doing with an outside eye, which was really helpful.
Yeah, definitely. Because I always wonder how difficult it is to share hats, like to go, okay, well, look, I'm directing this section, but I have a producing role, and I can imagine that it's very, it's kind of hard to kind of let go of one element as well. But
yes, I mean, I think that's always hard, and I think that there's lots of, but I think that ultimately she knew that the power was then going to be in the performance. You know, once we'd really agreed the screenplay was where we wanted it to be, she was free to be able to somehow perform it as if the writing was someone else's. And there was such an amazing sense of her. I mean, she said she felt she was kind of shedding skins as she went through this trial. It was almost like a sort of religious kind of passion she was going through. She was sort of bearing witness for all these women who had been in this situation, and sort of tearing off these skins and throwing them down, and then moving on to the next kind of trial of Sandra. And we shot it quite chronologically, so it was sort of, you know, escalating to the trial and all that happens thereafter, just when you think the film has ended. And so it was like almost not like acting. I mean, there was a moment where, you know, I showed it to someone and they just said, "These aren't actors." And I thought, well, that's a compliment. That's because that's really what we were going for. This is really happening. And the children helped that, because, you know, the children are it's either totally natural or totally fake with kids. And those children were quite remarkable. Yeah.
Definitely watching it, there was an emotional truthfulness to it. And when you get again to the scenes when it's in court, it's very difficult to watch because it's too true, you know? It's screened now at a few festivals. How has the response been? I can imagine a story like this is very personal for people to watch.
Yeah, I mean, I think we were quite overwhelmed in America, where people stood up at screenings at the Q&A. Well, first of all, stood up for Claire. You know, it was amazing, the first performance of it. But people stood up in the kind of Q&A and said, "This is me," or "I was one of those children when my mother picked me up and ran from my father." That people, so many people, and people from real middle-class families who had been in this situation, had been somebody in the story. So I think that really overwhelmed us. And when we waited afterwards outside, and people were coming and saying, you know, "I know this person, I know that person," as if the idea that it only exists, this world is a sort of, you know, it only exists in extreme poverty. We know there's an economic signifier, you know, a factor in this, but at the same time, it's a much more common experience than maybe many people know. And of course, horrifyingly so during this last 6 months, where we know people are stuck in, you know, isolation, where abuse can happen with some kind of impunity, because people are, you know, apparently have the excuse to stay behind closed doors. And where do you run to in a pandemic? You know, it's so oddly, the film, you know, we finished it just before Sundance, and the last 6 months seems to have just sort of sharpened its focus, these themes of isolation in an abusive relationship, and then community, and how we've all started to think about how good are we as neighbours. You know, what is our responsibility as a neighbour, as a community, to each other. So I hope that it will, you know, we want it to be a spur to social action, to political change. We need more social housing. We need to bring rents down. We need more refuge for women. We need men to stop. It's not just men, but I'm just saying the majority of cases of abuse will be men on women. That but also we want it to be a spur for women. We want it to inspire the possibility that change is possible and that there may be a way out. We're not being, this is not a fairy story. It needs us all to participate in this.
Definitely. I think watching this film, and again, I know everywhere kind of suffers from it, but there's a deep misogyny, I think, in Irish culture that stems from the fact that for so long, a lot of our laws, and I think there's still elements of it there, were from, like, historically were created with kind of a Catholic ethos in mind. And if you look at, I still think, like, it permeates a lot of different areas. So I think in our recent government, they've defunded a lot of the women's charities, or they've cut back on funding for a lot of women's charities. And even things like, you'll just see it throughout lots of small areas like that, where I think for a long time in Irish culture, you just don't talk about things. You don't air your laundry in public, and you'd crack a few jokes. Like, that would always be the way. Gallow humors is a big part of it, but you don't talk about things. And I think the last referendum we had, a lot of women were talking about women's issues, because I do think, again, like with domestic abuse, there's a huge shame in it.
Cool.
Again, it shouldn't be, but it's there.
Yeah.
Like, I think a lot of it is women have been gaslighted for so long that they blame themselves.
Yeah, they think they're complicit in some way. Yeah.
Why didn't you leave? Why didn't you leave? Why didn't you leave? And I think films like this, and there's been great films about domestic abuse, but again, this film feels just the most authentic one that I've ever seen. And it does something, and a little bit like it gives, Claire's character has such agency, has such power, and it's a very healing thing to watch, because it's almost like a kind of beautiful reimagining of someone taking back that agency. And I don't kind of want to give too much away, but it really deals with that so long. But I think it definitely settles in Irish culture so well, which is, sorry, I'm going back to my point somewhat of a wider route, but like, yeah, all our, I don't know, I think things are shifting here very, very slowly. And I think they have been for the past few years. And we've been shirking off those ideologies in a lot of ways. But I think once a film like this is so important, because as COVID happens, it's very easy to regress. It's very easy when times are hard for, like, culture to kind of shirk backwards and get more conservative again. You can see it's happening in the States. So I just want to say how important this film, and the way it tackles those those themes with such empathy and such thoughtfulness is excellent. Anyway, so that isn't even a question. That's just me saying I love it. Anyway, really authentically, like, think that it's a very important film.
Thank you.
And again, well, do you know, it feels very truthful to watch, like, and I think that's what great art does.
Thanks, Gemma. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Go back to the questions though, sorry. Like, watching it again, like, and it does it in such a beautiful way, and it's very subtle, but yeah. Anyway, but just to get back to, like, the logistics of shooting something like that in such a short time, because there's a massive time frame to that, and there's so much physical building that has to happen as well.
Yeah, I mean, just for the real kind of those who are interested in the process of it, actually, you would normally, especially on a low budget film, you would want to go to a location and shoot all the scenes that take place on that location. But of course we couldn't do that, so we had to build a house. Claire and I had been on a year before, in preparation for the film, we went to the Centre for Alternative Technology in Wales, and we went on a timber frame house building course, which was our prep for then helping the rest of the actors to be part of this. But we had to we had to first of all use the digger, to scrape the ground, and then we had to go away while they built the foundations. Then we had to shoot that. Then we had to go away again. So that wasn't particularly cost effective in terms of use of time. And in 5 weeks, you have no time. So I guess it was just a matter of preparation and brilliant director of photography, Tom Comerford, who helped me plan it. And I think that one of the things I wanted to do was really shoot what I wanted to see and stay close to Sandra. So, we didn't always cover everything from every which way, because I just knew sort of where I wanted to be looking. And of course, all those rules were made to be broken, and some things were harder to plan because there was no house at the beginning. So you couldn't go, well, let's put the camera there or there. You were like, I wonder what this would be like. And then there were kids, and, they're only allowed to work certain hours. And with children, however instinctive they are, they get tired, and especially if you're repeating takes again and again. So there were a lot of logistical challenges, but I think the fundamental thing was rehearsal with the camera, rehearsal with the children, and kind of something to do with the trust between, a lot of those actors like Kathy Belton, like Ian, who come from the theatre, like Conleth, Harriet, Claire, all those, that core, they all come from the theatre, where you've got to be, you've got to be prepared to bungee jump, because who knows what the hell is going to happen in front of a live audience. And those kinds of actors are very adept on a movie set at being able to take change and improvisation and subtle shifting. And so I don't know how we finished on time, but maybe we didn't. We ran over a little, but not enough to upset the apple cart too much.
Fabulous. And did you, in the edit process, was that a long thing as well? Because again, I think with things that involve construction, you kind of, script supervisors, I presume, have to be on the ball there.
Yes, I mean, interestingly, I felt very bad for Christine, our wonderful script supervisor, who, kept us on track in terms of who was wearing what scarf on what day and what morning, and who had changed their socks. And in the end, I completely threw all that out the window as the structure. I mean, what came together really well in the editing process was the structure of a scene. In fact, I shot quite a few scenes on one shot, maybe one other shot, but where and somehow the kind of the parts of it, those internal parts, came together quite easily. But the actual momentum of Sandra's the early journey, and how much momentum we gave, and I think that was the thing that we wanted to feel, that this wasn't somebody who just sat on their arse all day, kind of waiting for social services to come and dig them out. This was someone who was working there, working like a fiend.
But that's some of the common misconceptions that people go. They're like, oh, well, you get a free house. I'm like, no one gets a free house.
Yeah.
Like, oh, you get all these supports. I was like, if you don't have like a full-time free childcare minder in your family, like, what are you supposed to do as well? Like, there's so little. There's so little given.
Yeah. So that we were really keen to show that she was working every hour she had spare. And so, the point I was going to make was just that, they say a film is made 3 times, the third time in the edit. And I think what we did know was that we had the beginning and the end, and that's always with any piece of drama of any kind is quite is reassuring, knowing what your starting point is. We did a lot of wrangling of how explicit to be with the violence. We shot a horrifying sequence of the opening. I'll do that again because of that ping. We shot a horrifying opening sequence, and in the end, I decided to stay again close to what was in Sandra's head, which was that the PTSD meant that a lot of it was blocked out until it came out. A lot of it was suppressed and coming out in fragments, and that you didn't necessarily need to see every ghastly smash of her at the beginning, that it would emerge and the audience could also intuit the amount of trauma that she'd suffered. So yeah, all parts of the process, the development of the script, the shoot, the edit, were kind of incredibly rich, and we were open all the way to the way it might go. Just as we tried to be open. We didn't know we were going to shoot. We were going to have a Brazilian actress and a Russian actor, and we knew we were looking for a kind of diverse group. But it might have been a Spanish actress and a Polish actor, or it was about being sort of open and listening to people the whole way along. Trying.
Of course, and I was going to say, just from when you had maybe the original treatment before you went through the vigorous script edits, and then when you have your final, say, synopsis written out, what would be the biggest changes that would have kind of happened over the course of the development and edit?
God, I don't know. I mean, I think that the biggest shift probably along the journey was an irising down towards Sandra. There were other characters that we gradually began to feel perhaps were sucking the energy from her, and that in order to really clearly mark this as a film as opposed to a piece of television, I mean, that's a real moot point as to what's the difference. But in my guts, I felt that for this to be a movie, there's a kind of Saint Bridget mythic vein about Sandra, and if you stay with her and you don't try and develop all the other characters to make them as detailed as Sandra, which that's where you end up feeling that you're in an episode of a television where everybody is going, and we're going to see them in episode 2 and meet them more. But actually stick with her, stay close. And I think that really would be the biggest shift along the way to that's the process, the sort of alchemy, the refinement of it.
That specific court case as well was very difficult to watch, because like that as well, these people are so powerful and so charming. They twist things in specific ways. So I just felt like it nailed every detail authentically, and if not like to the letter, emotionally authentically. So
Claire had really done her research, not just through her friend, but she'd also we'd both spoken to judges, and she had worked with Women's Aid, and I think she really, really had gone deeply into the procedure and the experience of women who'd been through this. We wanted that to feel that there wasn't a single kind of received idea about how this is, but that this could really be happening.
And I was going to say, is it tough to sit in themes and processes like that for the course of a feature? Like, as you know,
I think you feel like you are, you know, you're I think pushing Claire through some of that, you know, sometimes you're kind of lifting her through it, but occasionally you feel you are with an actor, you know, you want them to go right to the edge, right to the brink. And so sometimes I felt like, my God, that you are watching somebody truly suffering in front of your eyes. And that was painful. Sometimes we had to go for a Guinness to just recover our senses. But that was no hardship in that city.
Yeah. And anyway, so totally on a lighter note, everyone should go see this film in the cinema.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me on the show.
Thank you so much. Okay. So we have across Ireland and the UK, Herself will be in cinemas. Well, thank you so much. That's brilliant.
Gemma. Nice to meet you.
Lovely to meet you.
Okay, bye. Bye. Good luck. Bye.